Right off the top, I'm telling you that we're expecting a guest in the next half hour. He is going to be talking with us about an effort to bring an end to the Refugee Resettlement Center here in Twin Falls. His name is Rick Martin. Rick is a military veteran, lives in Buell, has been working on this for a very long time, but he says there are a lot of misconceptions about the referendum that he's proposed, and he'll be joining us, as I say, just after the break at 8:30. 7 minutes after 8 o'clock, Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 30, and on our way into the mid-30s before the end of the day. I did want to open the show and do some follow-up to a discussion we had yesterday about the Hammond Ranch. Now, as many of you know, Dwight Hammond and son Stephen both surrendered yesterday and have gone back to federal prison. And as a caller pointed out yesterday, it's a bit like double jeopardy with what's going on there. There was a news conference after our program yesterday that was held at the Wildlife Refuge near Burns, Oregon, where Ammon Bundy and his brother Ryan and another group of ranchers have gathered from really all over the Mountain West and the Southwest, and they're holding out at the Wildlife Refuge, in a sense, in what is civil disobedience. And many liberals out there, of course, are screaming and yelling that the federal government should go in there guns a-blazing and clear these people out because, well, liberals don't like them. And liberals are against violence, unless, of course, that violence can be turned against people who don't agree with them. So for the edification of the liberals in our audience today, I brought along some of the sound from that news conference yesterday that was conducted by the eldest Bundy son, as well as some of the others who are involved in what has been labeled a takeover. Even though these buildings were wide open, there were no trespassing signs that were sitting anywhere near there. The doors were open. They just simply showed up. They walked in and they sat down. How is that any different than a group of college students who are protesting that the food in the dining hall is racist and they occupy an administration building? Or a group of skanky hippies, old hippies, go out and occupy a park in some city and crap on police cars and commit rapes in tents and don't bathe for a month? How is it any different than that? These people would seem to me, in fact, at the Wildlife Refuge, to be a little bit cleaner and a little bit more polite when it comes to what you might call a takeover of these facilities. This is Ammon Bundy explaining yesterday during the news conference, and it was a long one. It was nearly half an hour. Right about noon, probably our time, would have been about 11 o'clock in the morning, Oregon time, saying that he had been in contact with the Hammond family. Now, remember, I told you yesterday when the Hammond lawyer said, the Hammonds want nothing to do with these people. That's because the Hammonds don't want to be treated poorly by the federal government. That's because the Hammonds would like to get this over with and hopefully come home as soon as possible, if that will happen. They may end up rotting away in jail, and the old man may die there, for all we know. And when we said that the Hammonds wanted nothing to do with it, I pointed out that Dwight Hammond actually greeted these people at his home on Saturday, and he thanked them. And he also went on to say during that brief appearance before them that this was not about him, but about America, which should tell you that he does sympathize with them, despite what mainstream media would like to tell you. So this is Bundy explaining that he has already had some dealings with the Hammond family, but the Hammond family had to keep those under wraps.
It means that they have reached out to individuals that we are closely affiliated.
Now let me just start this with saying he's initially talking here, I'll repeat this, he's initially talking about law enforcement making contact with him. Then he segs into his discussions with the Hammond family.
It means that they have reached out to individuals that we are closely affiliated with and have give messages to us.
What are those messages?
That they intend not to come upon us.
Have you heard anything from the Hammond family in regards to your statements here about them today?
Well, I just made them, so no.
Well, I mean, did you contact them in advance of the statement to see where they feel about you?
My relationship to the Hammonds has been about 8 weeks ago. I came to Burns and I met with them many times in their homes. I watched them in tears multiple times as a 74-year-old man covers his head and cries and asks, how can this happen to another individual? I love the Hammonds. I can sympathize with them. I can empathize with them. And they were afraid that after the threats came from them for speaking to me, they did pull back and have continued communications through, should we say, alternative ways. But I have not spoken to them in several days.
In other words, the brain dead in media don't get this. Now, I used to work, obviously, in news reporting some years ago, and you needed a bit more on your feet, I guess, in those days to do it. And I knew prosecutors who told me stories about prisoners who were locked up in very bad prisons. And if those prisoners were withholding something the prosecutor wanted, there was a case of a guy who'd murdered a couple of young children. And I can remember covering his case in the middle of the 1990s, and he got locked up in Walpole State Prison in Massachusetts, where the other prisoners were beating him up every day, and he wanted out of there. He wanted in a better prison. One of the children's bodies had not been recovered, so the prosecutor said, "You tell me where it is, and I will move you, not to a country club, but I will move you to a nicer prison." Now, the Hammonds have done nothing of that nature. Obviously, they are not, in the eyes of many, they are simply not criminals. They are wrongly, unjustly prosecuted in this situation, but they face that same type of threat from a prosecutor. Now, there's more on this. There's another rancher who is speaking at this news conference. If you'd like to see the news conference in its entirety, it's about 28 minutes long. There are several sources of it that have been posted to YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and you likely just you search Ammon Bundy, you're going to come across this posted within the last 24 hours. This is Lavoy Finicum. He's a rancher from Arizona, and he's explaining that the dire situation that's taking place is impacting ranchers across the West. So even though you say, well, it's only the Hammonds, it's not me, I'll forget about it, I'll just lay low, you can't do it any longer.
Let me explain it simply as I can, as I try to stumble over my words here, is that for myself as a rancher, my ranch is Northern Arizona, a bureaucrat behind a desk can write a statute regarding me, my ranch. It has the force and effect of law. This bureaucrat is not accountable to me. We have not elected him there. Now, if I get contrary to that statute, there's a federal ranger with a gun that can enforce that. And if it goes from there, I am brought into a federal court. Neither the law enforcement, the federal ranger, has been elected by us, the people here. They are not under the power of the recall. Neither the bureaucrat that wrote the statute, neither the law enforcement that enforces it, and now I am hauled into a federal court. All three branches of power under one head with no representation. Did we not, as Americans, face this issue some 200 years ago? Don't we remember that phrase, taxation without representation?
Now, I've got more with Lavoy Finicum and with Ammon Bundy from that news conference I'll be sharing during the program this morning. It's 8:14. If you'd like to reach the show, you can give us a shout at 736-0300. That's 736-0300. Or reach me by email at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. We have a caller with us, and you're up next. You're on News Radio 1310 KLIX. What's on your mind?
So I haven't really been following it as much as I need to, obviously. But that's exactly the last clip that you just played. It was exactly what I was thinking. These are bureaucrats. They were not elected. They're not accountable to the people. We've allowed this to happen. We've allowed the bureaucracy to become a fourth branch of government. They're not elected. They're not accountable, and we've allowed it. And it's ridiculous, and I stand behind these guys. Even if they did something wrong, they weren't terrorists. The judge was right saying that they weren't terrorists. That's why he didn't give them the minimum.
Sure. And he thought it was an injustice from the very beginning. I thank you very much for the telephone call. The prosecutor in the case, the woman who was the prosecutor, as it turns out, several people have shared this story with me. She was an Obama appointee, appointed as the prosecutor in 2011, federal prosecutor. Her previous experience in law and government had been working in child protective services. She had no prosecutorial experience whatsoever. None. Zilch. Nada. She grew up on a commune with a communist hippie mother. Her own daughter won't talk to her today and thinks she's strange. And she eventually resigned her position some months ago because she had taken a liking to a man who worked in her office and was stalking him. This is the individual, the unstable individual, who not only prosecuted the case, then appealed it as well, and got the Communist Ninth Circuit in San Francisco to go along with putting these two fellows back in prison. The case is now getting a lot of national attention. Right up until yesterday, I was listening to Sean Hannity, who clearly doesn't know much about it, or didn't at the time, talk about how awful these guys were for taking over the wildlife refuge. It seems now, though, that official Washington, that is, the conservative mouthpieces in Washington, are getting on the bandwagon because they're educating themselves on the story. This is from David French. He's a lawyer. He's writing for National Review, which, of course, was founded by the great conservative William F. Buckley, and he writes, "The Case for Civil Disobedience in Oregon." Protesters allege, he writes, that when private landowners refused to sell, the federal government got aggressive, diverting water during the 1980s into the rising Malheur Lakes. Eventually, the lakes flooded homes, corrals, barns, and grazeland. Ranchers who were broke and destroyed then begged the government to buy their useless ranches. By the 1990s, the Hammonds were among the few private landowners who remained adjacent to the refuge. The protesters alleged that the government then began a campaign of harassment designed to force the family to sell its land, beginning with barricaded roads and arbitrarily revoked grazing permits and culminating in absurd anti-terrorism prosecution based largely on two arsons, and he puts that in quotes, that began on private land but spread to the refuge. While arsons might sound suspicious to urban ears, another familiar, or anyone familiar, he writes, with land management in the West or even the South and Midwest, knows that land must sometimes be burned to stop the spread of invasive species and prevent or fight destructive wildfires. And he goes on to say, at trial, the jury found the Hammonds guilty of maliciously setting fire to public property worth less than $1,000. In other words, a couple of juniper trees. They were acquitted on other charges. The jury deadlocked on the government's conspiracy claims. While the jury continued to deliberate, the Hammonds and the prosecution reached a plea agreement in which the Hammonds agreed to waive their appeal rights and accept the jury's verdict. It was their understanding that the plea agreement would end the case. Then it went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The court ruled against the Hammonds and rejected their argument that the prosecutor violated the plea agreement. By no stretch, Mr. French writes, of the imagination were the Hammonds terrorists, yet they were prosecuted under an anti-terrorism statute. The government could have let the case end once the men had served their sentences, yet it pressed for more. And the whole time it held in its back pocket potential rights to the family's property. To the outside observer, he writes, it appears the government has attempted to crush private homeowners and destroy their livelihood in a quest for even more land. If that's the case, civil disobedience is a valuable course of action. And he goes on to write this, I sympathize with the ranchers' fury, and I'm moved by the Hammonds' plight. According to multiple accounts, they are good American citizens. Even the prosecutor noted that they have done wonderful things for their community. The district court noted that the character letters submitted on the Hammonds' behalf were tremendous, and that these are people who have been a salt in their community. Federal government, the writer says, has pursued them like a pack of wolves. That's why there are great Americans right now interrupting their own lives and perhaps facing their own prosecution who have taken over that refuge center, at least the buildings at that refuge center, in support of these people, because they need to bring attention to a gross miscarriage of justice. We've got more on this coming up in just a couple of minutes. More from the news conference, in fact. It's 8:20. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. 28 at our studio. If you're just joining us, in the last segment of the program, I was sharing with you some of the sound from a news conference conducted by the ranchers who were occupying the wildlife refuge buildings in Oregon, not far outside of Burns in Harney County, where yesterday Dwight and Stephen Hammond went back to federal prison. 8:24, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And what I'll do is I'll share more of that news conference with you in just a moment. But I'd like to remind you as well, coming up tomorrow morning on our program between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. Likely Dr. Jonathan Tripp will rejoin us in studio. We'll have one of the medical professionals from the office that will come by, and we'll have a discussion on an issue related to your health. You'll also have an opportunity to give the doctor or one of his assistants a shout, that is by telephone, perhaps get your question answered. And that's free medical advice from a friendly voice. Keep in mind, Tripp Family Medicine is located on Fillmore Street, right here in Twin Falls, directly across from the main post office. And as they like to say at the office, life's too short not to feel good. This, again, is Rancher Lavoy Finicum, and he is from Arizona. He is among those who are occupying the buildings at the refuge in Oregon, and he's trying to explain to the reporters, many of them, as I said earlier, who don't have a lot going on from the neck up, trying to explain to them what this is really all about.
1/3 of our landmass. It's an empire within our own country. unaccountable, unelected. The real power is in the bureaucracies. And so that's kind of the simple part of it. It's about family. It's about my family. It's about the Hammond family. I've spoken to many ranchers in Utah, in Nevada, in Arizona. And they are all feeling the same thing. They're all feeling this oppression that is coming down upon them. Their livelihood is threatened, being taken away. Their ranchers are being regulated out of business. And so this is real. These families are real. They're not trying to cause problems. They're food producers. They help make our country self-reliant, free, independent. Do you realize that you have to go back to about 1955 to get as low as the mother head count as we have right now in the United States? Have any of you ate a steak lately? Do you know the price of that? That goes way up. If we had more demand, if we had more production, we would ship out more, we would feed more, we would be self-reliant as a country. These are good people. They produce, they add to our country. They do not take it away. I want to say one more thing about here, what we're doing. Every one of you that says this is an occupation until their demands are met, you misunderstand. We're not making demands. We're not making demands. We're here to work. These buildings here belong to Harney County. These are Harney County public lands, the state of Oregon. This is theirs. This is their land. This is their state. It's theirs. And so we've come here to work. We've not come here to sit as children and stamp our feet and demand that certain things are met. We're going to go to work. We're going to try to help restore these ranchers that have lost their ranches back to them. We're going to legally go to the records. We're going to search out these ranchers. Over 100 ranchers have lost their ranches here in this very area, in this very county, have been pushed off. We would like to see them return to their ranches, ranch again, log again, live again as free people.
Live again as free people. And as we told you in the last segment of the program, government has been very heavy-handed in its attempt to drive people off the land, basically bankrupt them, and then have them sell the land at cheap rates, and then the government says, aha, it's now part of the refuge. They even had a woman there. She came from southern Utah, and she sat down and actually in front of the reporters read all of the statutes, read the laws, giving the basis for the argument that the ranchers have. We have a caller with us. You're up next. You're on the air on News Radio 1310, KLIX, at newsradio1310.com.
Good morning, Bill. The bigger picture is all part of the United Nations Agenda 21 Wildlands Project to create 50% of the land mass of the U.S. into a game preserve. And the introduction of wolves, the EPA's war on coal and our power generation, kicking the people off their lands, these ranchers like the Hammonds and so forth, is all part of a bigger agenda of the United Nations coming down through our State Department to these bureaucracies that have obviously taken upon themselves all this authority. They have their own military and so forth. It needs to stop. And these people are doing the right thing, and I appreciate your efforts to expose. But this is all coming from a top-down program, again, through the Obama administration, to destroy private property, which is part of the Communist Manifesto.
Hey, thank you much for the telephone call. And keep in mind that Republican candidates for president have been mum on this particular story, which tells you that we don't have a lot of spines there either. Now, I'll share one other quick thing. Mother Jones Magazine, which is a communist front, and I'm not, you may think that's harsh, that I'm being hyperbolic. No, it's a communist magazine founded by a woman named Mother Jones. Well, it's named after her. Reported that Ammon Bundy in 2010 took a loan from the federal government for his trucking company, and I guess the inference is, well, he's relied on the federal government there. What's his beef? What does taking a loan for a separate business from a separate part of the government have to do with the argument? And you can see what's happening here. Lefty is trying to obfuscate. Lefty is trying to distract you. You're going to be hearing a lot of that in coming days, weeks, or even perhaps months, as long as this lasts. Don't be fooled by these people. They're not our friends. We've got to take a stand, and we've got to filter what we hear and do it reasonably so we understand exactly what they're up to. Rick Martin's scheduled to join us in just a few minutes on KLIX.